The winter sky over North Africa was the color of gunmetal when the first British shells bounced off German armor like pebbles. In the dunes outside Gazala, 1942, the desert shook with the roar of engines and the crack of tank guns. But something was horribly wrong. British crews watched in disbelief as their shots sparked harmlessly off the sloped plates of Panzer IVs and deadly Tigers, while German shells punched through British tanks like they were made of paper. Inside cramped steel coffins, men could hear the thud of their own guns, feel the recoil slam through their chests, and then the answering hit from the enemy that ended everything in a burst of homenium and torn metal. Command blamed tactics, politicians blamed training. But in the choking dust of battle, tank crews whispered a simpler, more terrifying thought: our guns are useless. What no one knew, at least not yet, was that somewhere behind the lines, in a workshop that smelled of oil, sweat, and burned steel, a rejected idea was slowly taking shape. An idea that would turn those same British tanks into the nightmare of the German Panzer Force. His name was Arthur Briggs, and on paper he was nothing special. A staff sergeant in the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, posted to a maintenance depot that looked more like a graveyard for burned-out machines than a place of miracles. To the officers, he was another pair of hands. To the tank crews who knew him, he was the man who could coax life out of twisted steel. To himself, on those nights when the desert fell silent and the wind blew sand through broken hatches, he was a failure carrying the weight of too many dead men's faces. Arthur had watched a Valentine tank limp into the yard, its turret scorched, its crew silent, empty seats where men should have been. The commander who brought it in had given him a look he could never forget. Part accusation, part plea. Why couldn't we hurt them? In Arthur's mind, that question never stopped echoing. He knew the numbers. The standard 2-pounder gun in many British tanks was accurate, quick-firing, and neat on paper. Armor penetration tables, effective range charts. A tidy world of figures and lines that said it should work. But war didn't happen on paper, and the 2-pounder's armor-piercing shells shattered against upgraded German armor that was thicker, better sloped, smarter. Crews were ordered to flank, aim for tracks, call in artillery, anything but admit the truth. The gun was falling behind the enemy's steel. Arthur's hands were always blackened with grease as he repaired yet another bent barrel, yet another shattered breech. But his eyes? They were on the shell fragments, on the broken armor plates, on the scars where German steel had laughed at British firepower. He began to sketch in the margins of his logbooks. New shell shapes, modified recoil systems, some way, anyway, to force more punch out of the same old barrel. One night, under the weak light of a swinging bulb, Arthur spread out a collection of forbidden treasures on his workbench. Captured German ammunition, shrapnel dug out of ruined tanks, fragments of their own failed shells. By regulation, this was classified material, meant for intelligence officers and design bureaus thousands of miles away. But Arthur didn't care about that. He cared about the faces of the men who climbed into tanks, knowing they might not climb out. He weighed a German armor-piercing shell in his palm, heavier, longer, sharper. Beside it, the stubby British shot looked almost polite. He imagined what was happening at the physics level. Velocity, impact angle, density steel against steel, and what determined which one lived. The answer, he realized, was not just thicker guns or longer barrels. It was how the force was delivered. That single thought drew a line in his mind, a divide between the world as it was and the world where British shells could finally bite back. He started small, because all revolutions do. At first, it was just a modification to the propellant charges, carefully measured, slightly increased, pushing the limits of what warehouses declared safe. Then it was experimenting with the machining of the shells themselves, adjusting the shape of the nose cone, tinkering with the hardness of the cap. Some of his ideas were borrowed from rumors of what the Germans were using, others from half-read technical memos that most mechanics tossed aside. Inside that stifling workshop, the air stank of cordite and sweat as he and a couple of trusted fitters worked unofficially, after hours filing, hammering, testing. They loaded the first of Arthur's fixed shells into a scrap barrel set up as a test range behind the depot. The blast slammed into their chests, echoing across the dark desert. When they walked up to the steel plate afterward, the men were silent. The usual chalky crater was gone. In its place was a clean, smoking hole. He wrote it all up, because that's what the Army demanded: reports, schematics, justification. Proposed field modification for improved armor penetration on existing 2-pounder guns. He explained the altered propellant, the redesigned shot, the minor changes to recoil buffers to handle the extra stress. He didn't call it revolutionary. He didn't have the right to. He was just a sergeant, after all. And sergeants didn't change doctrine. They followed it. But as he sealed the envelope and addressed it up the chain of command, there was a small spark in his chest he hadn't felt in months. Hope not just for himself, but for the crews whose lives hung on whether a shell could go 3 centimeters deeper into enemy armor. Days turned into weeks, battles came and went on the edges of the desert, and the answer that came back from the distant, polished desks of the rear was cold and familiar. Rejected unauthorized modification. Potential safety hazard. Not in line with current doctrine. Arthur crumpled the paper in his fist, his jaw tight, feeling the words burn deeper than any explosion safety hazard. Doctrine. The neat language of people who heard about battles in reports, not in screams. The next day, another crippled tank rolled into the depot, its crew shaken, one man blind from burns, his voice hoarse as he whispered, "Our shells just bounced off them, Sarge. We hit them first. Didn't matter." Arthur felt something inside him snap, not in rage, but in a kind of cold, stubborn defiance. If the men in offices wouldn't listen, the steel in front of him would. The workbench, the shells, the guns. He looked at his hands, at the scars etched into his knuckles by years of fighting machines and time. If he did nothing, more crews would die. If he went ahead with his rejected fix in secret, he might get court-martialed, but they might live. In that moment, with the desert wind moaning outside and the scent of burned fuel still in the air, Arthur Briggs made a decision that would change the way British tanks fought. He would do it anyway, and one day German tank crews would learn what it felt like when British guns finally bit back. They started calling it Briggs's Folly before the first modified gun ever fired in combat. Word travels quickly in a war zone, faster than trucks, faster than orders. Someone had heard that a REME sergeant was messing with charges, another that he was turning our guns into bombs in our own faces. At the depot, Arthur listened to the jokes without flinching, but each one sank into him like shrapnel. He knew the risk was real. Overload the chamber, and the barrel could rupture, mistime the recoil, and the breech could fail. A mistake wouldn't just mean a broken gun, it could mean a dead crew. That knowledge sat like lead in his stomach as he stood in front of a row of battered Crusader tanks, each one with its 2-pounder gun pointing accusingly at the empty desert beyond the wire. The sky was a hard, pale dome overhead as he briefed the first group of volunteers, tank commanders and gunners who'd already seen what doctrine could do to them. "You don't have to do this," he told them quietly. Voice flat, steady. "This isn't on any paper. If something goes wrong, they'll blame me." One of the gunners, eyes ringed with fatigue, gave a short, humorless laugh. "If something doesn't change, Sarge," he replied, "we're dead anyway." The first field trials were held at dawn, while the desert was still cool and the shadows were long. Arthur had chosen a patch of hard ground beyond the depot, where they dragged out dented armor plates, old track segments, even a discarded section of German Panzer turret salvaged from a wreck. This wasn't a laboratory. It was a mechanic's test bed. Ugly, improvised, real. He watched as the Crusader's gunner loaded one of his modified rounds, the slightly longer, heavier shot sliding into the breech with a metallic clack that sounded to Arthur like the closing of a door he could never reopen. The tank commander gave a terse order. The engine idled low, a steady growl. The gun elevated a fraction. Adjusting for distance, Arthur's heart thumped in time with the tank's rattling bulk. Then the commander dropped his hand. The gun fired. The blast hit the air like a physical punch. Inside the tank, it was a confined explosion of sound and pressure. Outside, a sharp, brutal crack that echoed off the dunes. For a fraction of a second, Arthur saw nothing but dust and smoke as the gun belched flame. He braced himself for the wrong kind of sound. The shriek of torn metal, the panicked shout, the signal that he'd just killed his own side. But it didn't come. Instead, the tank's commander popped out of the turret, coughing, eyes wide. Recoil felt heavier, he shouted down, but she held. The gunner's voice followed, hoarse but almost disbelieving. Target penetrated, Sarge. When the dust began to clear, Arthur walked forward with slow, deliberate steps, his boots crunching on spent casings. The German armor plate that had once mocked British rounds at close range now held a single, clean hole punched straight through, edges curled inward like peeled metal. He pressed his calloused fingers around the impact, feeling the heat still radiating from the wound. This wasn't a tiny improvement. This was a different gun. It should have been enough. In a just world, test results like that would have flown up the chain, flipped opinions, rewritten orders. But wars are fought by people, and people cling hard to what they already believe. For every crew that came back from trials whispering, "It works, it bloody works," there was an officer who frowned at unauthorized modification, at the risk of barrel wear, at any deviation from what London had approved. Arthur found himself summoned to a makeshift headquarters tent one evening, the canvas flapping in a hot wind, maps of entire campaigns pinned to a flimsy wooden table. A major with polished boots and tired eyes read his report with the kind of skeptical calm that could kill ideas without ever raising a voice. "Sergeant Briggs," he said at last, "I see your figures. Impressive on the face of it. But if we start letting every clever sergeant rewrite our gunnery practices, we invite chaos." Arthur swallowed hard, throat dry. "With respect, sir," he answered, "chaos is what we've got right now when our shells bounce." The major sighed, fingers drumming on the table. "You have no authority for this. If something fails in combat, it won't be on paper. It'll be on us." That night, Arthur walked the depot alone, weaving between hulks of tanks silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Each one seemed like a sleeping animal, dented armor catching weak light, gun barrels pointing at nothing. He could hear murmurs from the crew tents nearby, men laughing too hard at bad jokes, trying to push back the thought of what tomorrow might bring. He paused beside a tank whose side plate was scarred by impact marks, each one a story of survival by inches. He rested his palm against the warm steel, feeling the day's heat still trapped within the image of the test plate with its clean hole burned in his mind. He knew what his fix could do, but he also knew he was one decision away from disobeying the very system that had trained him. Could he live with that? Could he live with doing nothing? The questions circled him like vultures. Somewhere deep inside, another voice spoke. "You don't have the luxury of waiting for approval when men are dying now." The turning point came not from a meeting room, but from the front line. A few days after the trials, a Crusader tank that had volunteered for unofficial testing came back from a skirmish near the front. Its paint was blackened by near misses, and his commander climbed down from the turret with shaking hands and eyes burning with something like fury or triumph. Arthur met him halfway, heart pounding. Before he could speak, the commander grabbed his arm, fingers digging into grease-stained fabric. "We hit a Mark IV head-on," he said, voice rough, urgent. "Didn't bounce, didn't glance, went right through, saw the bloody thing stop dead. They bailed out, Sarge, Germans, running, from us." The words hit Arthur harder than any reprimand ever could. For the first time, a British crew had looked a German tank in the face and not flinched. For the first time, their gun had spoken in a language the enemy understood. Fear, whispers spread faster than official bulletins ever did. In mess tents and around fuel drums turned into makeshift tables, stories grew. Tanks with Briggs rounds that punched above their weight, German crews confused, then cautious, then suddenly less certain of their invincibility. Arthur's name floated through the stories like a rumor, rarely pinned down, often mispronounced, but always tied to one thing: the fix. And yet, back on the paperwork trail, he was still just a sergeant with a rejected proposal and a warning in his file about unauthorized experimentation. That dual reality weighed on him. He knew that if something failed, if a barrel finally cracked under the strain, his small revolution could be strangled in an instant. Some nights he stared at his notes, at the carefully scribbled calculations and test logs, and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. Not in the physics, but in daring to step beyond his station mechanic, not designer, fixer, not inventor. Who was he to change the course of a war fought by nations? Then another message came in, this time not from a depot or a frontline tank, but from higher up. A different kind of officer, one with oil under his fingernails instead of just ink on his hands. A colonel from the Ordnance Branch, visiting forward units to assess combat effectiveness, had heard rumors of British tanks suddenly punching above their grade. He asked questions. He inspected spent shells. He listened to crews who had no reason to lie. And finally, he walked into Arthur's cluttered workshop one evening as the sergeant bent over. Another gun, filing a part by hand. "You're Briggs," the colonel said, not asking. Arthur straightened, wiping sweat and metal dust from his brow. "Yes, sir." The colonel held up one of the modified shells between thumb and forefinger, turning it in the dim light. "You've caused a lot of trouble, Sergeant," he said quietly. Arthur's stomach clenched. Then the officer smiled. Just a flicker, gone as soon as it appeared. The right kind. In that moment, surrounded by the smell of hot steel and machine oil, Arthur realized something. His rejected fix was no longer a secret experiment. It was a weapon the war could not afford to ignore. They did not give him a design office or a research budget. They gave him a corner of a drafty shed and a stack of paperwork to make sense of what you've done. Arthur sat at a rough wooden table under a single hanging bulb, the light yellow and weak, and tried to turn desperation into process. On the surface, it was simple. A heavier charge, a modified shell shape, a careful adjustment to recoil and breech timing, but underneath was something harder to capture on paper. The feel of a gun, the way metal flexed and sang under stress, the instinct built from years of listening to engines and bearings and bolts under load. He traced lines on diagrams with a blunt pencil, marking where pressures peaked along the barrel, calculating how far he could push British steel before it stopped being a tool and became a threat. As he worked, he heard tanks idling outside, the distant clank of track and the shouts of crews. Every sound was a reminder. These were not academic numbers. Every mistake he made here could mean a fireball out there. The colonel who had visited his workshop did not forget him. A week later, Arthur found himself standing in front of a small gathering in a larger tent, its canvas walls lined with maps and technical charts. The audience was a strange mix. A handful of senior officers with clip-butt accents and polished shoes, a couple of other REME NCOs, and even a quiet, bespectacled civilian from Britain who scribbled notes faster than anyone could talk. "Gentlemen," the colonel began, tapping a pointing stick against a battered German armor plate with a clean hole through its center. "This is what Sergeant Briggs' unauthorized meddling has achieved." The word unauthorized hung in the air like smoke, tinged with irony. Now Arthur stepped forward, heart pounding, palms damp. He explained his process in plain soldier's English. No grand theory, no jargon, just what he'd changed and why. He talked about velocity, about impact angles, about how the same old gun could behave like a new weapon if pushed within the lines of what the steel could handle. Some faces in the room remained hard, unconvinced. Others began to crack, curiosity breaking through caution. When he finished, there was a brief, heavy silence. Questions followed, sharp and testing. "What is the failure rate on barrels after your modifications? How many rounds fired per gun? What about the risk to the breech mechanisms?" Each question came like a shell in a barrage, testing his defenses. Arthur answered with numbers where he had them, with honest admissions where he did not. "We don't have years of formal testing, sir," he said at one point, meeting the gaze of a brigadier who seemed particularly skeptical. "We have weeks. We have what the desert gives us. But I can tell you this, more of our tanks come back when these rounds are in the racks." The brigadier's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. The colonel watched the exchange with a measured look. The bespectacled civilian wrote 3 words in his notebook, underlined twice. Combat data speaks. In that moment, Arthur understood something else. This was not just about a fix. It was about whether the people who made the war's decisions could admit that salvation sometimes came from the bottom up, from the men with dirty hands and sleepless eyes. As the weeks passed, word came back from more fronts, not just from Arthur's depot. British and Commonwealth units that had quietly adopted his modifications, sometimes officially, sometimes with a wink and a nod, reported encounters that would have been unthinkable months earlier. One letter from a South African unit described a duel at medium range with a Panzer IV. We expected the usual first shots bounce, then we pray. Instead, we saw our first round punch through and watched their tank stop as if hit by God's own hammer. Another report from a British regiment spoke of a German crew abandoning an engagement when their shells failed to break through, but British rounds started to bite. The psychological effect was immense. Tanks that had once felt like thin-skinned coffins now felt, if not invincible, then at least worthy of the fight. Crews walked a little taller. They joked, grimly, about Briggs's special medicine for German armor. The battlefield equations were changing, one modified gun at a time. Yet with success came a new kind of tension. Supplies of shells had to be standardized. Ammunition depots needed clear instructions. What had begun as one sergeant's careful tinkering now needed doctrine, procedures, training manuals. The machinery of the army woke up slowly, gears grinding as it tried to absorb this unplanned change. Arthur found himself pulled away from the front more often, summoned to meetings behind the lines where men in staff uniforms asked him to explain, again and again, how exactly he had decided on his adjustments. Each time they seemed partly impressed, partly uneasy that something so important had begun in such a small, unofficial way. "You understand," one senior ordnance officer told him in a low voice after a long session, "if we put our stamp on this, it becomes our responsibility if something goes wrong." Arthur nodded. "If we don't," he said quietly, "it's still our responsibility, sir. Only then it's the crews who pay." The officer stared at him for a moment, then looked away, as if the weight of the truth was almost too much to hold. Inside, Arthur lived in a strange duality. On the one hand, he could not ignore the evidence. His idea was no longer a rumor. It was saving lives. On the other, he could not shake the image of a barrel finally giving way, a breach failing, a tank turning into a furnace with a British crew inside. That fear became his shadow, following him from workshop to test range to briefing tents. It was there when he adjusted the tolerances again, shaving just a fraction off the maximum pressure to sit a little further from the edge. It was there when he argued for more training for gunners, on new firing procedures, for better maintenance schedules to check for micro cracks. There were moments alone at night when he wondered if he should have left well enough alone, if it was his pride that had driven him to push past red tape. But then he would open another report from the front, read of another crew who didn't die this time because the shot went through, and the doubts would shift. Perhaps, he thought, the greater sin would have been silence. Eventually, the war's senior leadership did what wars sometimes force men to do. They adapted. Somewhere in the quiet rooms where orders were written and stamped, Arthur's fix began to appear not as unauthorized modification, but as approved field adjustment, and finally as part of new official ammunition patterns and gun protocols. The transform was not dramatic. There was no grand announcement, no medal pinned to his chest in front of assembled ranks. Instead, small, bureaucratic changes accumulated. New shell markings, updated technical manuals, a brief line in an ordnance circular crediting field experience in North Africa with demonstrated improvements. Arthur read that line once, in a cramped office lit by a fading desert sunset, and felt a strange, quiet satisfaction. His name was not there. It didn't need to be. The guns were changing. The odds were shifting. But even as his work moved from controversial to accepted, he could not allow himself to relax. The war had entered a new, brutal phase. German armor was evolving too, with thicker plates, deadlier guns, ever more sophisticated designs. It was no longer enough for British tanks to simply survive. They had to dominate. Engineers back in Britain were already working on bigger weapons, 6-pounders, 17-pounders, monsters of steel that would redefine tank combat. Arthur knew those projects would eclipse his own modest fix in raw power. And yet, he also knew something else. Until those new weapons arrived in numbers, until new tanks rolled off production lines and onto ships, it was his rejected adjustment that stood between many crews in silence. In a war where time itself was a weapon, he had bought Britain something priceless. A bridge between weakness and strength, between fear and defiance. built not in a gleaming factory, but in a dusty workshop by a mechanic who refused to believe that good enough was the best his men deserved. They came to him first as whispers, stories of British tanks standing their ground where once they would have turned and run, of German commanders complaining that Tommy's shells are not what they were. In early spring, as the desert winds shifted and the heat returned in full, Arthur was ordered to pack his notes, his gauge tools, in a single battered suitcase. A truck drove him past rows of tanks under camouflage netting, past gun pits and fuel dumps, toward a small airstrip. An RAF transport waited there, engines ticking over, propellers chopping the air into hot, dusty currents. He climbed aboard with a handful of other officers and specialists, the inside smelling of oil, canvas, and nervous sweat. As the plane lifted out over the sand, the airfield shrinking below into a patch of fragile order in a case of rock and dust, Arthur realized this was the first time he'd left the front since his